Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Society and the State. This is episode number 57. I'm alongside Brian Hyde here in our wannabe studio. We're talking today with John Dougall. He's the state auditor for Utah, but we're actually going to be talking. He's also a former state representative, my former state representative once upon a time. We're talking to him today, though, about Puerto Rico and some of the aftermath that he's been involved in. John, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you, too.
So I remember when I have gone to a few different countries off the beaten path, Central America, Africa, and I tell people where I'm going, they have no clue where it's located on a world map. So maybe let's start with the basics. You know, is Puerto Rico an African country, or where is it? Is it a state? Let's do a little bit of background for some of our listeners who may need it.
Sounds good. Yeah, Puerto Rico and Costa Rica, two different places. So Puerto Rico is a Caribbean island like Cuba, Dominican Republic out there off the Florida coast. It has been a U.S. territory since 1898. During the Spanish-American War, Spain ceded it over to the U.S. And the island is about 100 miles by 35 miles. So those that live in Utah, this is basically Brigham City to Provo and a little bit narrower than Park City to Tooele as the crow flies.
Mm-hmm. So small island, it's a territory, and they've tried to seek statehood, right? There's been attempts to try and be formally recognized as a state and join the union, and to date they've been unsuccessful, right?
Yeah, you have kind of three factions there, and I would describe it as my experience when I lived out there in 85 to 87. About 40% of the Puerto Ricans wanted statehood, about 40% wanted to remain a territory like they are today, and about 20% wanted to become an independent country and break away from the U.S. But they've never really, the last vote they had, I think the majority of folks wanted statehood, but that really rests on Congress to decide whether or not someone can become a state.
Now, obviously, the impetus the impetus for our conversation today is Hurricane Maria happening at the time of this recording about 3 months ago. And so it sounds like you've had a previous personal connection being in Puerto Rico, and I know a lot of people across the country saw what was happening to this, territory formerly known, this island full of great people that was devastated by this hurricane. So maybe tell me first, from your perspective, what was it like watching that when you kind of knew, the people, the communities, the culture down there? What was it like to observe that hurricane and the devastation that it wrought?
Well, so let me back you up just a little bit. Puerto Rico actually was hit by two hurricanes. Hurricane Irma hit it around September 9th, and then Hurricane Maria hit it again around September 20th. And the interesting dynamic, so when Irma hit, it knocked out the power for 1 million folks. The population in Puerto Rico is about 3.4 million. So about 1 million people lost power, all sorts of damage, trees down, water facilities damaged, so forth like that. But then you get the direct hit from Maria that just pummeled the island. And that is when you had almost everyone lose power. And so, if you visited there, especially out in the rural areas, while it's wealthy as an island, it is actually quite poor when you compare it to the mainland. Mm-hmm. And so you just think about folks with corrugated metal roofs and wood homes and other things like that, and just, what was happening to them and the terror of this kind of storm. Folks on the mainland were concerned about the magnitude of it. Think about a small island getting hit by it, mm-hmm. and the storm just encompasses, and then some, the size of the island. I think they said Maria was about 400 miles across. Wow. So you think of that size of Puerto Rico versus the size and strength of that storm.
Now,
and here where I live, my power, my telephone, cable, that's all buried. It's under the road. So, a hurricane's not going to rip it up. Out there, most of that infrastructure is up in the air, going mm-hmm. from pole to pole to pole, strung kind of in a rat's nest.
Yeah, I always chuckled when I was in Honduras. You'd see we called it in Spanish el alambre. It was all the wires running around, and yeah, it was like a rat's nest. You'd have hundreds of cables all interconnected, tying into the same pole, and the flimsiest of winds would come in, and people would get knocked out of their power.
Well, I met a gentleman down there. His name was Victor Felix, and he talked about he had a 2-story home, cinder block, first story, wooden second story, and the roof was ripped off his home. The top story, they were putting blankets, towels, Pampers, diapers to try and seal out the windows and the doors to keep the water from coming in. We saw places where you saw inside the home a watermark that was 7 feet up on the wall. And then we saw other places where you saw the watermark was actually on the second story. So we're talking, this is probably about 12 feet up, you're seeing a watermark.
Wow.
And so this is the amount of water that was going through some of these areas. I mean, sometimes when we think about a flood, we're thinking about 2 or 3 inches of water in the road, or maybe a foot. But it's hard to think how you survive when you've got 6, 8, 10, 12 feet of water just cascading through your community, through your neighborhood.
So, John, I want to ask you in a moment about some of these stories because you went down there with the group, you've been providing aid, and I'd like to get into that a little bit. Before I ask you about that, though, I want to share with our listeners why I wanted to have you on to talk about this, knowing that you've had some firsthand experience, both before, long before the hurricane and since hurricanes, plural. And that is that I find when events like this happen, they're all over the news. We hear about it nonstop. Social media erupts. People change their profile photos. We have our daily, mourning, our momentary sympathy, and then we move on because there's the next thing we're supposed to pay attention to, be outraged by. And unfortunately, in that, 24/7 social media news-driven cycle, it is very easy to completely forget the people who are impacted by, what happened a day, a week, a month, or a year ago. What's your observation about this? Do you share my concern or observation that, we kind of collectively as a society focus on, let's say, specifically Puerto Rico and the devastation that happened, but now, a lot of people have moved on, forgotten about it. Is that a concern? How do we try and ameliorate that problem so that those in need, in this case in Puerto Rico, can continue to get attention, support, and help?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really easy. Americans are really generous, and they respond when they see there's a problem. But somewhat because of media attention, other things like that, we see the blips of the attention of the damage. But then once that passes, the news media moves on. We don't necessarily hear. If we've got family living in the area, we'll hear stories. But other than that, most of us stop hearing about concerns. We're not hearing about issues down in Houston, but there still are some. We're not hearing about things down in Florida. And I'm not seeing in the news as many reports about Puerto Rico as that week or so right after the storm. And so this is important for us to continually look and reach out, because when a storm blows through like that, the problems aren't solved in a day or a week. I mean, I think there are going to be Puerto Ricans that are without power for 6 to 12 months.
Wow.
Imagine living where you live today. I mean, I back in December 95, I lived in California. We had a major storm blow through there, took out a generator or a transformer in our backyard, and 3 homes in my neighborhood were out. So we were low down on the priority of getting repairs, and we were out of power for 6 days. Okay. But you leave the community, Domino's could deliver, other things like that. Imagine, if you will, an island in which I think the report was 90% of the people, 90% of the homes and businesses were without power. And when we were down there, 2 and 3 months later, the majority of people still did not have power. And when you hear the occasional reports of, last week I heard 60% of Puerto Ricans now have power, that's kind of hit or miss. We were at one facility, a church on Sunday briefly when I was there, and the first 2 minutes was great. The air conditioning was going, the fans were going, and then boom, the power went out. So this is a building that's considered having power, but it comes and goes. And it was out, who knows how long the rest of the day. And if you think about the basics of life, food and refrigerator and things like that, you can't store anything in your fridge if the power comes and goes.
Right.
You just, so you're having to go to the market every day, hoping that the market has food that you can buy, other things like that. This is one of the ironies of some of the restaurants and the bakeries have become a lifeline for the folks that are living there. because they're preparing food and they're running generators so they can refrigerate their food so they can provide it to the communities where they live and stuff. And so it's just been interesting. When I was down in Puerto Rico for vacation 4 years ago, my daughter loved this one bakery near the resort we were staying at. And so she was really concerned after the storm what happened to that bakery. And it turns out the bakery was fine, but they were doing 4 to 5 times the normal business.
Wow.
Just because nobody had the power to cook their food and other things like that. And so they became this lifeline to helping provide for the community.
So let's talk a little bit about your specific relief efforts, but then also in the context of the broader relief effort. Obviously, there's been a number of, shipments, cargo, relief supplies being sent to the island. You guys have been part of that. So what was your specific project? What have you been involved in? And then maybe to the extent you're familiar with it, talk about the broader relief effort that you've been aware of in the months since these hurricanes.
So the day after the storm, so September 21st, Tani Downing, who's the Director of Administrative Services for the state, and myself started talking about what can we do. And then we teamed with Durrani Rodriguez, who is a local attorney here in Utah, who moved here from Puerto Rico, and started raising money, several $1,000s, to try and help out with relief. Shortly into our efforts, we ran into another Puerto Rican transplant living here who was a neighbor of mine here in Highland, now lives up in Alpine, Jeff Mendez, who's a senior VP in charge of sales for Vivint. And Vivint was working to do a relief drive, getting supplies that they could ship down to Puerto Rico. And I think we ultimately ended up filling up 3 tractor trailers worth of relief supplies. They got put onto pallets, loaded into trucks, and then ultimately shipped down to Puerto Rico. And so that was that effort that was going on. Another month or so after that, we encountered a group called Light Up Puerto Rico. And their focus was to bring light to the island. And so we teamed with them. And so the last 2 trips in November and December that I took to Puerto Rico were part of the Light Up Puerto Rico effort. And the key vision behind Light Up Puerto Rico is that there are so many people without electricity that if we can just bring down a little bit of light, a solar flashlight, if you will, this is a little something to light up their life. It gets really dark at 6 o'clock at night. It's dark for about 12 hours. There's no street lights and other things like that. So it gets really, really dark. And so the key thing is providing solar generators, solar flashlights to folks. And the key thing there is once their power is restored, for them to pass it on. We're trying to leverage those devices so it's not just put on somebody's shelf. I'll give you a story of a gentleman. We were down there just a couple weeks ago, and we were desperately trying to find a restroom as we were driving back to where we were staying. And gas station after gas station was closed, and we finally found a Burger King, and we went in there to go use the restrooms. And we encountered a gentleman who was a nurse who had just gotten off work at about midnight, and we were there about 12:30. And he had felt I should just stay here a little bit longer. And he was having dinner, and we came in and started talking to him about whether he had water, whether he had power. And here it is, essentially 3 months after the hurricane, didn't have either one. And so we started showing him the solar flashlight and solar panel that he could use for charging other devices. And he, at first, was a little skeptical. Well, how much does this cost? And we were like, this is free. The only commitment you have to make is when your power is restored, share it with someone else who doesn't have power. And then once their power is restored, have them pass it on and pass it on and pass it on until the whole island is lit up and stuff like that. And he started tearing up there in the Burger King as we're trying to share a little bit of light with him.
That's amazing.
And a little bit of love. And for Puerto Ricans, I mean, they kind of expect Puerto Ricans to come help them out. They're a little surprised sometimes when it's a bunch of white guys, if you will, white guys and gals from Utah, being the first relief workers showing up 3 months after the hurricane to where they live.
So when you say the first workers, I mean, one of the first, relief workers, what's been kind of the impact overall? Has, the government been providing relief, or have you seen more, these nonprofits and folks like yourself just kind of mobilizing spontaneous order, getting involved and doing things? What's been the relief effort more broadly to the extent you're aware of it?
I think you've got a whole mix of different activities just because of the magnitude of the destruction that's there. And so, we had shipped, like I mentioned, all these pallets of relief supplies. We had shipped it down, and so the city of Guaynabo was generous enough to allow us to use one of their warehouses to stage those pallets so we could distribute those. And so on a Saturday the Saturday before Thanksgiving, the lieutenant governor and I visited briefly with the mayor of Guaynabo and his cabinet. And there were about 40 people there, and this was a Saturday morning, and they were just talking about their strategy to go out that Saturday to provide relief in their community. And so these are Puerto Ricans helping Puerto Ricans. Well, later that day, we were down on the southeastern side of the island in a community called Naguabo. And this is one of the areas where Maria first landed. And so Naguabo, Humacao, Yabucoa were hardest hit by the storm. And so you had the mayor there, Mayor Marcano, who was out there all afternoon, evening with us as we were distributing supplies. And we were handing out food, water, hygiene kits, clothing. We were going home to home with solar flashlights. We were deploying tents. And so imagine, if you will, an island that rains almost every day, living in a home that had the roof ripped off by the hurricane. And it's 2 or 3 months later, and you're still living in that home where it rains almost every day. And so we're deploying tents, bare bone tents, to help folks have a place that they could stay that was not getting soaked in the rain every day. And so you saw government, local communities providing relief, and clearly you saw volunteers. We were out there, and one of the key things with Light Up Puerto Rico is not to just be there in October or November or December, but we have trips currently planned out through June to try and reach out and to help, provide relief and support. We did see one FEMA location that was there providing reliefs and doctors and other things like that. We did run into a couple of FEMA workers, but it's few and far between. And the magnitude that we're talking, the first trip when I was out there in November, as we drove around, about 90% of the stoplights were out. And imagine trying to navigate that kind of situation, especially when they don't treat it as a four-way stop. It took us about 45 minutes to get through one intersection. The second time we were out there, actually most of the stoplights were working in the areas that we were driving through. And so clearly there'd been a lot of work to try and restore things. The first trip when I was down there in November, shortly before Thanksgiving, we saw one power truck replacing a pole that had been damaged, and then one driving down the road. This last trip, we saw at least 12 that were actively repairing different things. But you have different dynamics. When you had one community in Juana Diaz down on the southern side of the island near Ponce, where they were basically not getting a good answer when power would be restored to their neighborhood. And so the neighbors all pitched together $80 a house to buy 5 poles and then paid extra to get those poles installed, hoping that would speed them to getting power restored to their neighborhood. And so you saw a mix of government stepping up, but you saw private citizens coming together out there, and you saw other, folks from the mainland coming down to provide relief. You have a story of July and Jose, and their homes were cut off from the closest community. And so a couple of days after the storm, they were sitting there, and then they realized that they were going to be cut off, and the only way to get connected to the community was for them to clear the road. And these were trees, I think these trees were 50, 60 feet tall that were blocking 2 miles of roadway. And they pulled out their chainsaws and just started clearing the road because they knew that they were the ones that were going to have to provide that relief for themselves. They couldn't just wait for somebody to show up to help them.
John, I got a question for you about government involvement. From what you're describing, it sounds like the private sector has been able to step up and make a very decisive difference. I know early on there were those trying to make political hay out of the fact that the U.S. government, the federal government, should be stepping in and helping more in Puerto Rico. And apparently that was based on an understanding that Puerto Rico has a special relationship with the United States. I don't even know how to describe it. Can you help me better understand the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico? And from there, maybe we can discuss whether our federal government would have the obligation to step in and provide relief.
So Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. It became a U.S. territory in 1898. They became U.S. citizens in 1917, one of the Jones Acts. gave them citizenship and stuff like that. And so, but they're not a state, so they don't get a vote in Congress and stuff like that. And so they're this kind of weird situation where they're clearly U.S. citizens, a U.S. territory, but they're not a state. And so they don't get a vote in Congress. And so there is a duty from my perspective for the federal government to treat them like it treats other places in the U.S. and stuff. But this is one of those hard things of what exactly should they do? I would bet if you polled most Americans, they wouldn't understand that Puerto Rico is a territory, wouldn't understand that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. When you go down there, it's the same money, it's the same postal service, other things like that. It's all the same. And I think most of them don't know it. And in fact, I would guess that more Puerto Ricans live on the mainland than actually live on the island. There's lots in New York, Texas, California. Clearly, we've got a large contingency of Puerto Ricans that live here in Utah. And so you've got those dynamics. But then and they have to live by the laws of the U.S. So we have a different Jones Act. It's actually the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which punishes Puerto Rico just like it punishes Hawaii. It says if you're going to ship from the mainland to the island, you have to do it under a U.S. flagship, which usually costs a lot more money. I had a friend who was shipping some stuff to Hawaii, and it was 6 times more expensive to ship from the mainland to Hawaii than it was to ship from the mainland to China. And it was just perverse in terms of that Jones Act and how it punishes folks. And they lifted that act for an extended period of time for Houston, for Florida. For Puerto Rico, they only lifted it for, I think it was 10 days.
Right.
And that took a lot of political pressure to actually get that to happen. And one of the challenges as we were shipping stuff down there is clearly trying to get ships to be able to ship the supplies to the island and other things like that. And you look and say, okay, the U.S. should be there to help and not get in the way and interfere with the relief activity.
One of the interesting things that I've seen with what is commonly called the Jones Act, as you point out, it's the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, since there are different Jones Acts. But I know in the think tank world, from the policy side, I've spoken with folks trying to address this issue both in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and it's really fascinating to see some of the examples and the stories they mention of how this is, harming their economy. And one of the more interesting things that I've observed in this is that you have economists across the ideological spectrum that criticize this, Jones Act. You've got on the left, you've got Paul Krugman, who opposes it. You've got, the guys over at Cato who oppose it. All these economists recognize that by decreasing competition, the prices go up, and that causes great harm on just an average, day-to-day basis for people living in these locations where consumer goods end up being much more costly because the shipping price trickles down and the customer has to pay for it. But then you have examples like this where people are trying to get relief down there in the wake of a disaster, and thankfully it was waived for 10 days, but that expired. Department of Homeland Security said they're unwilling and they find it, quote, unnecessary to continue the waiver unless there's some compelling national security reason to do so. And so I find it interesting that all these different economists can agree on the economic harm that a policy like this causes, but the politicians are too slow to respond, and it's the people, in this case in Puerto Rico, that suffer.
Well, and this is the example of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. So the Puerto Ricans and the Hawaiians pay, but the part also that we don't see is that each of us pays as well. And the reason for that is there's a lot of pharmaceuticals that are produced in Puerto Rico that are shipped back to the mainland, and they also get hit by this. But because that's buried into the cost, we don't really see that we're paying extra for those kind of products as a result of this act and stuff. But those that are running these U.S. flagships, they get a concentrated benefit. They get an extra protection for their business, and they don't have to compete the same way.
It's important you point out protection, because when Trump was considering the waiver, he admitted publicly that he was being pressured by, quote, shippers, people involved in the shipping industry, not to grant the waiver, because of course they benefit from being able to charge higher prices by having less competition to deal with. John, let's wrap it up here.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
Let me fill you in one other thing. I guess 2 other things. First, on the flip side, let me give a shout out to JetBlue Airlines. JetBlue has partnered with us in the Light Up Puerto Rico effort and provided a highly discounted airfare for us to travel down there. and stuff. And so they've been a great partner to work with. And so here's JetBlue Airlines really reaching out and trying to help get relief supplies, relief workers down there, help get Puerto Ricans to the mainland so they can get better treatment and care on the mainland and other things like that. Really stepping up as an amazing corporation.
Awesome.
To reach out to the Puerto Ricans and reach out to help the Puerto Ricans. Let me touch on one other thing. In Puerto Rico, I forgot to mention this, temperature-wise, it's the island's basically 80 to 90 degrees every day, very humid. So think about living in very difficult situations where you're in that kind of heat, and a fan is kind of essential, tool to just have a little bit of relief from the heat. And so you have elderly folks, very ill individuals, just had major surgery, other things like that. Medicine needs to be refrigerated, or just a little bit of relief from a fan. We visited one lady who she was able to use the neighbor's generator 2 hours a day to just provide a little bit of fan. She's an 80-year-old bedridden lady and stuff like that. And so we deployed a solar generator, solar panels from another great corporate partner, Goal Zero, to help her provide a little bit of relief in her home, maybe help power the fridge, other things like that. We deployed some of those at other places where individuals needed to refrigerate medicine. And if you sit there, even if you're lucky enough to have a gas-powered generator, folks are spending $400, $500, $600, $700 a month just to power that gas generator. And so we think about what it would cost for us to provide electricity. I think right now for my home, it's about $80. Think about $450, $500 just to provide limited electricity. And that's kind of the challenges folks are living in down there. I think it's important for us to remember, continually reach out and look for opportunities to assist them. And let me give you a couple places as part of Light Up Puerto Rico, people can go to donate.
John, that's what I was going to ask, because you pointed out that when Americans see a problem, we're very generous. That's part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion. So yes, please, for those listeners who are now motivated to action, how can they do some good? How can they help assist?
So Typhi Humanitarian is one of our partners. You can go to typhi.org, TIFIE.org. You can go in there, click donate. You can click on the program. There's different programs they're supporting. You can click on Power Puerto Rico and donate to that program. You can also Google You Caring, YOU Caring, and with that, Light Up Puerto Rico, and you can donate to the Light Up Puerto Rico program as well through the You Caring site. And that provides money to help us buy products, relief supplies that we then take down to the island.
We will link to those for our listeners who don't, or perhaps you're driving right now and you're furiously trying to write this down. So we're going to link to those resources where you can help on today's show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/57. John, thanks for your efforts down there. For those of us who are more free market minded, it's always great to see private individuals stepping up to give specific relief without a lot of the, corruption skimming off the top that you so often hear from government relief efforts in the past. So thanks for what you're doing. Hopefully our listeners will be motivated to help, and please keep up the good work.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.